Next up, we have got Brian Chukwu-Smith from Equifax. Did I get that right? Yes, practiced. It's going to talk to us about cost allocation, but from the perspectives of the SREs, which is cool because I used to be an SRE manager. So I'm looking forward to this. Brian, over to you, mate.
Okay. So I'd like to take a moment just to recognize that we're on Kumyai territory. Okay. Like they said, my name is Brian Chukwu-Smith, and I work for Equifax. So I'd like to open with a question. Suppose you had two options. I realize there's a lot of details, so these perhaps we can't flesh out. But if you could demonstrate evidence of a large annualized savings through a direct intervention with an engineer, let's say 10% of your total budget. So if you're spending $10 million in the cloud this year, and you could save $1 million. Or if you could demonstrate that your business has consistently operated below your target cloud spend as a percent of revenue, which of the two options would you pick? Number one, people. Number two, people. Okay, a few different options here. 99 times out of 100, I would pick number two. And I believe that cost allocation is a key lever that we pull to get us in that direction. And I'm going to talk about why today. A little about Equifax. We're divided into several business units. Mine is called Workforce Solutions, and it's not related to your credit score. So unfortunately, I can't help you. We're in an active chargeback environment administered between several sources and several destinations or business units. And we've adopted 3 KPIs from the FinOps Foundation: efficiency, forecast accuracy, and allocation. I'd like to suggest that allocation is a little bit awkward. Everybody loves efficiency. When you go to your finance friends and tell them that we've saved money or that your unit cost is lowering, everyone thinks that's exciting. And forecasts are often pretty favored. Everyone knows that it's good to be close to your estimate of what you said you were going to spend last year. But I recently went to a product engineering lead and told him that we were involved in an initiative to allocate costs to the products that we're selling, to which he replied, "How many dollars is this going to help us save?" And I said, well, it's not really about saving money. It's about allocating it and making sure that we have the right people owning the budget. And his eyes kind of glazed over and looked at me like, is this a zero-sum value initiative? So I'd like to talk about why we allocate. To me, allocation is accountability. If someone owns the costs, they're responsible for them, which means allocation is also a motivator. If someone is responsible and accountable, then they're more likely to take action. And third, allocation leads us to unit cost. If we don't have a good representation of all the costs tied to a specific product, then we don't have a good idea of what the cost per transaction is. I recently went to a cloud service provider, and they found out that I was into FinOps. And they said, what's your cloud savings target? And I said, well, actually, for me, I'm more concerned with accountability and efficiency than I am raw dollar savings. And the reason why is because, as you can see in the picture, when we're only focused on saving and we're only interested in arm-twisting engineers, then what starts to happen is our engineers start to view us as the enemy. They're trying to move their initiative forward and get their revenue like that they promised their bosses they would make. And the FinOps practitioner, who believes that they have the right way to save dollars, is standing in the way of the initiative. This is a huge problem because we've suddenly stopped working together and started being seen in an adversarial way. I was really troubled when I saw the FinOps Challenges survey last year for this very reason. According to the survey, 30% of us believe that the number one problem we're facing is getting engineers to take action. And I believe that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of our role. Our role as FinOps practitioners is not to get engineers to take action. Engineers don't take action all by themselves. They don't set their own schedules or their own priorities, and they're not setting how they're going to be graded. Their managers set those for them. The business line leaders and product line leaders, who they're responsible to, tell them what they're going to do, and they're the ones who execute it. Now, if you're lucky, if you go directly to an engineer, he might give you an hour of his time if he likes you. She might decide that you're a really, really nice person, and she may donate a little bit of her spare time to make sure that she gets something done. But if you're really hoping to get a comprehensive change of accountability and efficiency, it's important that we understand who we're speaking to. And so I think we need to start thinking about where we can interface with the organization rather than trying to arm twist engineers. Before I talk about how we went about allocating, I'd like to talk about the problem with not allocating. And I have a few pictures to help illustrate the situation that I first encountered when I came to Equifax and how we changed it. The blue bars on the left represent our shared cost centers. There were several of these within our own environment inside of our business unit. And the red bars are our product lines. You can see that some of them were very cheap and some were quite expensive. And there were several chargebacks, but for the sake of brevity, I've included just one, which were administered to us through the general ledger and executed by a chargeback responsible team. Now, you would imagine product line 1 would probably compare themselves to product line 3 and say our costs are quite low, and our unit cost perhaps is quite good, depending on how many transactions they're processing. And so when finance comes to allocate costs, without any other ideas about how to do it, they allocate the costs proportionally. And so they give product line 3 a lot and product line 1 very little. Now, when finance comes and speaks to the product line leader of product line 3 and says, hey, you're way over budget, you're in big trouble and we need you to save money, the product line leader responds, so why am I over budget? And they say, well, it's all the chargebacks. The chargebacks that you have, they're really putting you like double your budget. And the product line leader says, I don't use any of those chargebacks. And so what's already starting to happen inside of that product line leader's mind? He's beginning to disregard what finance is telling him. Perhaps he'll take action if someone twists his arm, but in his mind what he's thinking is, I had sufficient budget until someone started pushing these costs to me in the general ledger, and what's happening doesn't make sense. So now let's think about how the engineers underneath him, whose time he's settling, are going to respond to you when you say, hey, we have these cost optimizing efforts to help you get under budget. They're going to be saying, oh, yeah, I talked to my boss about this, and this is pretty silly that we're getting all these charges that aren't for a service that we actually use, right? So we first started setting about handling the stuff within our own environment, and we allocated the shared costs to product lines, and this helped in a few ways. First, we started seeing that product line 1 was using a lot of shared tenancy projects. We used the cloud-native tooling within Google for Kubernetes, which is exported to the master billing data set in BigQuery to allocate costs with labels. And this helped us understand that the unit cost for product line 1 wasn't quite what we thought it was when we only looked at their own spend. So now when our chargeback center comes back around, they say, well, this helps a little bit, and we'll allocate the costs differently now. To which product line leader 3 still says, that's a little better, but it's still not exactly what I use. So what we finally had to do was go to the chargeback centers who did not report up through the same reporting lines that we did and ask them to prioritize allocating the costs to the correct products which they were being used for. This took some time and sometimes caused some friction, but it eventually came out that only one of the product lines was really using any of the chargebacks at all. I think it should be pretty obvious at this point which of the three images it makes the most sense to use for your unit cost. One would be quite misleading to say that your unit cost is cheap, and one would be much more accurate. We also, to assist those administering this general ledger, drew a chart, because when I think about allocating costs, I understand it as a hierarchical process. Our chargebacks at the top, we asked them to at least allocate to business lines, which were groups of product lines. Shared costs, where possible, were allocated directly to product lines, which were serving specific products, but if necessary, were sent to business lines, because then we could consult with the business line leader for an option to allocate costs to their product lines. This is my main point. As an SRE, I believe that our job is to determine the correct level of reliability and hold teams accountable. And I take that same mindset to how I do FinOps. I believe that FinOps is determining the right level of efficiency and holding teams accountable. Imagine that product line leader 3 again. If he doesn't know which of the costs are his, how can he be held accountable? If we try to institute unit cost, how does he believe or have confidence in what we have to say about his efficiency if we haven't allocated correctly? So then let's get into our strategy. We had to get alignment with leadership. This was actually easier than you would have expected. Before I even arrived, teams expected that unit cost was a simple calculation and would be accomplished quickly. As they began to realize that it was more complicated and required allocating work, the business line leaders were motivated to participate and were willing to prioritize in their sprints time for their engineers to label things correctly. We had to develop a labeling strategy and coordinate it with finance's cost center codes and company codes. And we had to develop allocation standards. Before we would execute something in the ledger, we decided that we would only allow things to be executed which were greater than 70% allocated, which of course then created leftovers, which we decided to allocate proportionally based on what we did know. The saying went something like, allocate what you don't know based on what you do know in any given project. And finally, we targeted the ledger as the source of truth. We tried to work with the teams who managed the ledger to make sure that costs were passed through so that it would be accountable within our financial structures. Okay. So we did this, like I said, in our shared tenancy projects as well as our chargebacks, but for the sake of time, I'm going to discuss a specific story of some of the outcomes in one of our chargebacks. So we had one particular chargeback that was about 40% of our entire cloud service provider bill for the entire year. We asked them to separate those costs between 4 different business units, and when they did, we got 4 different answers from those business line leaders. The first business line leader said, those chargebacks are more than I spend in an entire year for all of my own projects combined. How do I optimize that cost away? And by working with his engineers in the chargeback center, they eliminated 90% of their chargeback costs. The second business line leader said, I only use 100 terabytes of BigQuery. How can it be possible that I'm charged this much money? It's more than all of my projects combined. And so they began to interface with their counterparts in the chargeback centers, many of whom we'd already contacted ourselves, but when their customers were coming to them from within the organization, the teams acted quite quickly, and they were able to eliminate about half of their expenses. The third business line leader who we approached said, none of these costs are mine. Please send them to the fourth guy. To which I replied, I don't think he'll be very happy about that because this is the bulk of the charges. And he said, it'll be all right. Just let him know I said so. So I walked into the office of the fourth guy, and I told him, well, you're going to have all of these costs that we thought were yours and all of the costs of this other business line leader who said they're all yours. And he nodded his head and said, yeah, I think that's right. I think they really are all mine. But this is a lot of money, so we need to figure out what we're going to do about this. To which I replied, well, we could attempt turning off some of these things on the weekends as a short-term fix, but there's some other long-term work which we could finish over the next 3 to 6 months, which eliminates a lot of the waste. He said, well, that's fine, but let's coordinate with DNA to find out if it's really actually worth it. So DNA ran some analysis on the jobs to see if we turn them off on weekends in our lowest time of the year, of the week. And they came back and said, under no circumstances should you ever turn these jobs off because it's generating so much revenue, even on our worst 2 days of the week, that if you were to save even the amounts of money you're hoping to save, it would cost us huge amounts of revenue. Which really helped us as a practice understand how important these jobs were and why they were so expensive. This really helped us explain to finance, who was quite upset by this point, by the costs that were incurred, how valuable these jobs were, and why it was important for us to be really diligent in how we optimized. Over the next 6 months, we reduced the costs of the primary area where we were incurring expenses by about 50%, and the overall chargeback came down by about 27% after 6 months of work. Okay, so allocation led who to do what. Because we told teams what their share was, they took action. And because we spoke with business line leaders who were responsible for their budget and we leveraged the ledger, they told their engineers to go do work to reduce the costs. And it took a little bit of time sometimes, but it was effective because we interfaced with the level of the business that cared about the costs and was ready to take action. What did we do? We communicated with the people who were invested, and then when the engineers took action, we gave them credit. We put them on a leaderboard, we celebrated their successes, we told their leaders that they were doing a good job, and so by doing that, we helped maintain our own credibility. We did encounter some challenges. Like I mentioned before, labeling is often not perceived as exciting work. Some expenses are not labelable. So for example, in GCP, logging is not labelable. And so you have to do creative workarounds, which may take more time than it's worth, like exporting a sample of the logs to BigQuery, and then trying to find some sort of creative way to allocate the costs. Shared cost allocation strategies are often imperfect. Like we said, our goal was 70% for our shared cost product lines. And coordination with business units was often difficult. Finally, our current financial processes oftentimes didn't match our desired one. Even when we had a method to allocate costs in the ledger, sometimes we were moving too fast for our financial partners to keep up, and we had to be patient with what they had capacity and bandwidth to do. The bottom line impact was that our largest chargeback was reduced by 27%. Our cloud cost per revenue is half of our company's target, and we're down 10% since our allocation initiative began. Which brings me back to our first initial question. Which is better, raw dollar savings or efficiency and accountability? My personal conviction is that if we have efficiency and accountability, then the raw dollar savings should never begin in the first place. And we shouldn't have to go chasing $1 million at a time, which oftentimes rubber bands back the next month if no one's accountable for it. There's still some space to get those big dollar savings that might excite your business, but I think efficiency and accountability is always preferable in my mind. I'd like to give thanks to my finance partner, Elliot Davenport, who worked a lot with me in all of this, my supervisor, Chris Fry, who gave me a lot of latitude to do this work over the last year, and my project manager, Karen Cartier, who kept us on time, and Alexis Kritsky, who helped prepare this presentation. And I'd also like to give special thanks to my wife, who is here with me today, and our kids. Okay. I think we have Q&A time now.
All right, that was awesome. Thank you very much. I especially resonated with the engineers taking action piece. As an engineer myself, like that rubbed.
It hurts my feelings.
I was
You
like,
guys think
come
we're just
on,
not
man,
taking action?
we're doing our best.
Yeah.
All right, okay, who's got the first question? Over here. All right.
Hi, thank you so much for that. This was a topic I was hoping to come and attend as well. And frankly, I'm struggling in that showback, chargeback space, which is why I was here. One of the base questions I have is, how did you get to what was your definition or your company's definition of what is a shared service and what is something that is a chargeback that needs to be allocated? Like, how do you break it out?
Yeah. So I was fortunate in some ways that when I arrived, there was a clear definition of products and the product lines that reported up to a single product line leader. And some of those happened to be shared. And our cost centers aligned with those. So that was a helpful first start for me. And then we called anything within that space direct spend, and our partners in finance would tell us that. And anything that crossed business lines from outside Workforce Solutions, where I work, was referred to as an indirect expense, and it was designated that way. So that initial foundation was a logical place for us to start working on and saying, well, if X% of our costs are indirect, what was the source? And then once we realized that one of the main chargeback centers was the bulk of the costs, then it was very logical to ask them, well, could you please explain for us which products this is serving? And we didn't always get expedient answers quickly, but I think once we knew who to ask and that the reporting structure reflected that, that helped us a lot.
Hey, I'm actually curious, you mentioned you're an SRE. I don't know if it's like incident management and stuff like that, but I'm actually curious, how do you balance kind of the reliability aspect of what you do versus the cost?
Yeah, so personally, I think that SRE and FinOps are very similar, like I said in my presentation. Given that there's an error budget, which should be determined based on the value to the company, I think ideally you should be asking those trade-offs, because sometimes a business leader might ask you, hey, could you run it a little bit hotter? Like, could you sacrifice reliability a little bit? Like, don't pick the Corvette version of that service. Like, we need it to be a little cheaper. And being able to speak both languages, I think, really helps them, because we can say, yeah, I can do that, but it'll cost us half our error budget. And then you might not meet a deliverable next week. And I try to tell them not just options and see how they react, but I give them my opinion of what I think they should do. Because sometimes they may not know. And I think if I say, hey, I think you're going to blow the whole error budget on this optimization, and that's going to cost you 2 weeks of work. Normally, my rule is if optimization is going to be worth like an entire engineer's salary for the week, like we really need to talk to them about that. But if it's going to be less than that, then maybe we need to put it in their backlog and see if they can do it safely over time and determine when the right moment is, when there's an appetite. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I'm going to go over this side just because I need the steps.
That's at least 100.
That's right, it's a lot.
Thank you very much. Question for you when you get into some of the costs that are harder to allocate. So
Yeah.
I think you'd mentioned a number like 70%. So maybe I'll just call it that last 30%.
Yeah.
There's this part that I might get torn between of trying to, you just start allocating maybe based on a percentage of revenue because you don't know what else to do. Or you try and start getting creative, but then you're in diminishing returns because it's so complicated, no one can understand.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you draw that line of saying, yeah, I could be more precise, but if I'm too precise on too many things, no one's going to have the time to really understand it. So I really just default back to a percentage of revenue or something else.
Yeah. So again, like I always use the hammer that I know I have, right? So as an SRE, when we are deciding reliability indicators, one of the things we always tell them to do is use the data you have now first. And if there's an ideal data that you think you could get in 6 months, that's great. But right now, we're going to use what we have now. So if all you have is the Nginx load balancer to determine how fast it is, that's what you've got. Okay? We're not going to try and like instrument special UI, telemetry, so you can come up with some sort of ideal thing in 9 months, and then everything's going to be crashed already anyways. With FinOps, it's the same way. If the best way you can allocate costs right now is by the percent of revenue, that's fine. And then show it to people. Because what we inevitably get when we show the numbers to business leaders is they get, hey, that's not right. And when they say, hey, that's not right, you say, okay, well, what's the better one? Could you please publish those numbers in a place where I can query them? Because I'll gladly reallocate in a better way if you're willing to give me more enriched data. But I try to lead with the appetite, and I use what I have now. And if the best I can do now is a 50-50 split, I'm like, well, that's bad. I'm just going to 50-50 split it, and then I'm going to document it. And then everyone's going to say, well, that's awful. Why would you do it that way? Well, do you want to do a labeling initiative with me? It would really help me.
Lost allocation by trolling, right?
Sorry, that was loud.
Speaking of labeling, how many labels did you, or tagging, how many tags did you end up going with? And did you have to, or find that you had to do any compromising between finance and product in determining what labels you were going to use?
Yeah, I think we only had 2 for cost allocation purposes. It was really just a question of, is it what company is it for? Is it my company or somewhere else? And which cost center? And those just were directly mapped up to how finance did it. And none of that's credit to me. That was all stuff that people did before I got here.
Thank you. Real quickly, you covered something, either a group or an acronym, DNA. I'm not familiar with the term. Help me out here.
Oh, yeah, sure. It was our data and analytics group. The people who are doing work to find out, hey, where are our revenue opportunities from and all those types of research.
We've got 5 minutes left. Any more questions? Any more questions at all? Back there.
Well, it's not really a question, more of a, just wanted to clarify. Are you allocating costs based on revenue or based on consumption?
It's a mixture. So I don't allocate any costs on the basis of revenue because I think my partners in finance would get mad about that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you don't want to get punished.
I think typically the pattern for me is ideally we want things to be as automated as possible. So if someone is saying, hey, I think this cost center is costing us X dollars, and they want to publish their numbers of who called them, and then they want to allocate the costs based on the percentage of how many times they were called. I say, well, great, that's awesome. Yeah, I'll do that. And then we'll create a pipeline that moves that data around and transforms it and enriches it, and then it's visualized for the folks who are there. But then he's going to be held accountable, right? Because when a business leader is consuming his shared service, if that person says, you got 40% of the costs, and that comes out to X dollars, his friend's going to look at him at the table and be like, you charged me what? Like, why did I get that much, right? And then that conversation's happening between them, rather than me yanking on their arms or being, well, you just had to take those dollars, or whatever it was. But I mean, I think it's really up to each of our product lines to make a decision about how they want to allocate out. And I always give people a do nothing option. I say, okay, so I think that you should probably do it based on the number of times you were called. But you could also just put some labels out as a first way to allocate costs, and that wouldn't be so bad. And if you do nothing at all, it's just going to end up probably split up 50-50, and people are going to really not like that at all. And so I think if you give people a do nothing option, normally the first thing they rule away is the do nothing option. Like, well, I don't want to do that. You're like, okay, well, good. Let's talk about what you do want to do.
All right, cool. We've got 3 minutes left. One more question.
Would you mind sharing your experience with sharing idle costs in containers?
Sharing what costs?
Idle.
Oh, around like Kubernetes?
Kubernetes, yes.
Yeah. So there's a few ways that we've handled that. We use Cloudability, and Cloudability has some decent ways of visualizing that for people who are consuming it. If you're trying to get the costs to the ledger, the way that I kind of decided to handle things is you can apply, of course, labels to the cluster. If you're trying to get smaller than the cluster, then you need to start thinking about your namespaces, right? And you need to think about a mapping between namespaces and however you're trying to cost. So for us, it would be a cost center. If I think, this namespace, and this namespace needs to be mapped to this cost center, well, now we probably need a lookup table that defines what those relationships are. And then I need a job that's going to run to transform that data, because Google will export, if you enable the more recent versions of the Kubernetes master billing data set, it'll export those costs for you by namespace. I told Google, and you guys should tell them too, that they should make the costs by deployment, because that's even more granular, right? That would be even nicer if they did it that way. But they only do by namespace so far, and I guess they're just slowly walking it out. But even that is typically enough for most of our teams, because normally shared services are all piled underneath the same namespace, which normally map to a reasonably cohesive cost center. But if you aren't able to get that far, then you could still just send them to a cost center, and you could say, hey, business line leader, these all came to your cost center, and there's 4 product lines underneath you. We don't really have a good way to map these costs yet, so can you give me some percentages, and then can we put a roadmap item out there to figure out a good programmatic way to allocate your costs, where you're exporting and publishing the number of calls from Anthos or some sort of service mesh like Istio, right? That's all data that we can get if we want it. It just needs prioritized, and there's data engineering work to make it happen, right?
All right, thank you very much. Brian Chukwu-Smith. We've got one more? We've got 1 minute left.
Only
We're
1
super
minute,
fast.
sorry.
So what if you are allocating costs between both revenue generating and non-revenue generating teams? So would you then, if you can't really use like revenue as a common metric, would you then need to kind of figure out a common metric? Like maybe number of heads in each team, for example, or
I would avoid heads on a team. And like I said, I don't usually do revenue, because we do have non-revenue generating products. Maybe they're serving a purpose that doesn't immediately generate revenue, but it's still valuable. Sure. I mean, anything, if it's not a product line, then oftentimes I'll group it underneath the proportional spend type of chargeback, right? So if we know that there's, I don't know, like 10% of your total cloud spend does not serve a specific product, then to me that needs to be proportionally spread based on the remaining things that we did know. So that's 90% we did know, 10% left we don't know. We allocate what we don't know based on what we do know. That's how I handle that math. So if it's just a, hey, this is a black box to us, it's going to end up becoming proportional in my mind. I don't know if that answers your question, but you're free to ask me about it afterwards if I didn't do a good job.
I'm glad we caught that. That was a good question. All right, Brian Chukwu-Smith, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching that session. I'm sitting here in San Diego right after FinOps X. We hope you join us next year here live 2024. In the meantime, please subscribe to the channel and join the community. Get involved, join the summits, get in a working group, and don't forget to get FinOps certified. Because next year here in San Diego for FinOps X, it's going to be twice as big. Come join the party. Come meet your people. Welcome home.